welcome to Canonical, a conversation about books. I'm James Xiao, and I'm joined by Ia Darris.
Hello.
And Sam Spieler.
Hi.
Today we are beginning our new series on pandemic literature, starting with Katherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Let's start with our expectations for this short novel. Katherine Ann Porter published this in 1939, but it's set in 1918 during the flu pandemic. What were your expectations about Pale Horse, Pale Rider before you started reading it?
I really didn't have any expectation. I had never read her before. The reason why I selected this particular work to read is in the last episode we recorded, we were actually talking about how a lot of novels use pandemics as a kind of a plot device, and they aren't really treated seriously as important in and of themselves. So I went out looking for a novel that was directly about a real-life pandemic, and I discovered Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and I feel like it satisfied that goal of not using the pandemic as a plot device, but it wasn't as good as I hoped it would have been.
You know, what surprised me about that is actually there aren't a lot of books about the 1918 flu pandemic, even though it's a historical fact that, caused a lot of death. We actually don't have a lot of novels or articles or anything in our culture that references it.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. There's certainly a lot of articles and essays that mention that fact, that there aren't a lot of things written about it. I'm guessing because it took a backseat to the war, but yeah, it's a curious thing.
Even this book, which is ostensibly about the pandemic or about the flu, it really is about the war, in my opinion. So I guess, my expectations heading into this book were a little bit high. I've read some of her short stories before, and Katherine Ann Porter, I think, is someone who just is always on the fringes of literature, especially when you hear writers talk, like when you hear writers give readings, or when they talk about, how they hone their craft. She's a name that comes up a lot. To me, she's someone who doesn't get a lot of attention nowadays, except from other writers. So my expectations were rather high coming into this book.
I'm kind of in Ehad's camp. I didn't have any expectations. I knew of the novel, but didn't know much about it other than the basic topic. I guess it shouldn't have surprised me, but I didn't expect there to be such reliance on stream of consciousness, for lack of a better name, which bothered me in the beginning because it seemed scattered and fragmenting the narrative for no reason. But it quickly becomes clear that you're supposed to take that as the early onset of the flu, and it just hadn't fully manifested yet.
I didn't really feel that way when I first read the book. I didn't feel like it was scattered.
She jumps between not just the style, but there's jumps in time too. There's sections that feel like they're missing, and it felt like I was jolted from period to period. And at first I thought that was just style for style's sake.
Here's something that I think we should talk about. In the beginning of the novel, there's actually quite an unusual passage where she's talking about horses and riding alongside a shadowy figure. And at first I didn't really understand it, but then I realized that this story, or this novel rather, is connected to another novel that's published in the same collection, Old Mortality, which talks about Miranda as a child. And having taken a look at that novel, it kind of made the section at the beginning of the novel understandable. I could kind of see where it was coming from. but I still didn't really enjoy it. How did you guys feel about that section at the beginning?
I did not enjoy it when I first read it. And as I was looking for talking points and rereading passages, there's a lot of foreshadowing and a lot of symbolism early on that I had forgotten about until I reread it.
That's how I read it as well. I think it does quite a bit of work to set up the rest of the book. I think there's some debate we can have over whether or not it's effective at setting up the rest of the themes in this short novel. I think that the writing is, to me, an obvious reference to death. And I'm not really a big fan of that, but I think if it's a bit more acceptable if you read it in the context of Old Mortality, which I haven't read, but I also skimmed.
This is something that we'll talk about later, but this is a novel, and it has this kind of contingency. I think that really enjoying that portion of the novel depends on familiarity with Old Mortality, and I do think that this kind of intertextuality can be very enjoyable and interesting, but I didn't enjoy it here. It doesn't work. Not necessarily because it's intertextual, but because so much of the enjoyment hinges upon the reader being familiar with the other novel.
Do you think it's our expectation that this is a standalone? Because it was published with Old Mortality. It's published as the third book in that collection of as the third short novel in that collection of 3 short novels.
See, that's something that I think we'll have to talk about later, because Porter herself was very adamant that these be called short novels. And to me, I always think of one very important feature of the novel is that it's a self-contained whole. So even if it is published in one book alongside other novels, its enjoyment is bounded inside itself.
Something that surprised me, actually, not the form of it, but I was surprised by how anti-war the novel was. And I don't think I expected that at all, because looking back, we do think of modernist literature as being about World War I and about being in the trenches. But I don't really recall reading a lot of books about the domestic front and about this kind of all-encompassing war effort and its toll on mainly women, I guess, but also the left behind. So I thought that was really interesting, and I found that pleasantly surprising.
I did too. I really liked the, how did they put it? The dollar a year man. You don't really see too much of that. The kind of the governmental version of a Bible thumper who's trying his best to get you to do your part. And I hadn't really seen that in literature very much.
I think the distinction for me in terms of the novel's anti-war sentiment is that it focuses the sentiment on the people at home, and I think as time progresses, people are more willing to consider that a valid sentiment against the war or against wars in general, whereas previously I would suspect that people would say that only people who had actually been on the front lines and experienced firsthand the horrors of war would be validated in their criticisms. But now I think that we can say that this novel is maybe ahead of its time in the fact that it's willing to validate women's experiences and the experiences of people at home.
Yeah, I'd say that. I think that's one of the elements of the novel that makes it interesting and ahead of its time. I think another element is, or are, all the dream segments in the novel. I think we get some of that kind of stream of consciousness in other modernist writing for sure. She talks about how she's been influenced by other writers like Faulkner and James Joyce. And this book really reminds me of The Dead, especially the ending of it. It reminds me of the long short story, The Dead.
Well, let's talk more about that kind of dreamlike or hallucinatory section. The part that I'm most interested in is after she gets sick in earnest in the middle of the novel, she becomes delirious, and I'm just wondering how reliable we can consider her narration during that part of the novel.
Maybe half reliable, because some of the things she sees seem to be completely within a fever dream, but others seem to have roots in reality that we have to puzzle out. For example, when she first gets to the hospital, she sees an old man who's being ushered somewhere between two executioners, but maybe it's someone sick, someone who refuses to isolate or believe that they're sick, or maybe something else is going on. He does say, "Before God, I am not guilty." So at first I thought maybe it was unrelated and is just part of the hospital tableau, the chaos around her. But maybe he's sick and delirious and further along in the illness than she is. She's also getting to that point when they carry her in. But then immediately after that, she imagines her doctor, Dr. Hildesheim, I think is how you say that, in the anti-German propaganda image that was popular at the time, the baby killers with babies on their bayonets. So who knows what's real and what isn't?
Yeah, let me rephrase my question. I guess I'm not really concerned so much with how reliable she is, but with how fruitful this kind of hallucinatory prose is, because honestly, it seemed kind of shallow. It seemed not very meaningful to me when I was reading it. It was kind of just the signs of a person hallucinating, but it didn't really make me want to investigate it or to search out deeper meaning and symbolism.
Do you see that as representative of the style of the time? First of all, I can't really think of too many dream segments from or psychedelic or anything of the sort from that time that was vivid and clear and pretty per se.
Yeah.
Well described, I guess.
I guess I'm not faulting it for the prose style. I think that the prose style is passable. It's not bad. It just doesn't seem like it carries much meaning beyond just indicating that she's delirious. Like, what I would really have loved to have found in the novel is something more rich with symbol, like when she thinks that the doctor is a German spy, or I think she thought that the nurse's hand was a tarantula, or she thought that her bedroom was a jungle. It didn't really seem to add up to much. I would like it to be more substantial. What do you think, James? Is it meaningful to you?
I think it's meaningful in a different way. I think it serves as a testimony of her experience, not necessarily Catherine Ann Porter's exact experience, as in like a transcription of what she experienced, but I think it's a facsimile of someone experiencing the flu. So for me, those sections are actually what makes it explicitly about that flu pandemic, more so than any other section. It's kind of like her showing us, the reader who perhaps did not experience it, what it was like to experience the flu.
Yeah, I agree then that it does have some sort of, you could say, phenomenological value in that it can let you understand the experience if you haven't had it. But in terms of literary value, I just felt like I wanted something more.
I think that it was difficult for me to determine if there was any kind of symbolic meaning behind it, besides the fact that there are a lot of death imagery, and she kind of undergoes this transformation of sorts. It's really hard to say exactly what that transformation is in the moment. There's that passage where she almost dies, I think, and it's described as her being reduced to kind of like just one microscopic entity, right? And then she kind of comes back from the brink. Like, it's a way of describing her near-death experience. I thought that was interesting, but it's not. It doesn't have a lot of resonance because I think partly because of how short this is, some of the themes maybe are not fully fleshed out.
Let's talk a little bit now about the end, because I think the end is probably the most substantial part. What do you make of it? Do you think that Miranda, when she emerges from her illness, is a changed woman? And does her change, if there is a change, kind of repudiate her previous behavior or her previous attitudes?
I think she is changed in some way, but I don't think it's a repudiation. What do you mean by her previous attitudes? Like, what kind of attitudes?
Well, obviously, we're somewhat sympathetic to Miranda in the beginning of the novel, but she does seem a bit negative, more negative than perhaps we might like, you know? Obviously, that is showing more of her interiority, but if we're not expecting to see so much of her interior life, we might say, well, she's awfully down on everything. And after this near-death experience, is she still down on everything? Is she going to be a happy, shiny person from here on out? Is she going to kind of double down on sadness? What's going to happen to her?
You know, I think that's interesting. I have a very different reading of this book than you when it comes to, I guess, what she was. I didn't view her as very negative. First of all, since this is a very close third person, it came across to me as a very neutral tone throughout. I didn't read her as an overly negative person.
Well, negative, I guess, is kind of a difficult word to parse. I don't mean necessarily that she's, Debbie Downer or anything, but she isn't as upbeat or even neutral as other characters might have been. She seems to take issue with a lot of things. A lot of things seem to trouble her in terms of the way that people approach her and sit on her desk and the way that people ask her to buy war bonds. It just seems like there are a lot of things that bother her. And I don't know if it's fair for me to really criticize because I don't exist in those circumstances, but I feel like my own inner monologue isn't as negative as hers.
There's negativity, but there's also I think there's two different paths that she's straddling. There's negativity toward the things that you mentioned, but also there's a self-flagellation that's going on even before she's officially sick. The concept of pain is introduced very early on, and Death riding his pale horse is the first major image that we're given, following her everywhere in that first dream. But I don't really know how she's changed at the end. She feels like she might be more morose than she was at the beginning, that the pain in her life has only continued, and now she feels she's to blame for Adam's death. But it's a deeper, more profound sadness. But it ends before I think we can tell how it's going to affect her moving forward. I feel like the dream, that final dream, gives us this sense of calm and peace, but then immediately takes it away from her and returns her to pain. So I'm not sure what note she's striking at the end.
I read this as kind of a simple change. I don't think there's a lot of depth to it in my reading necessarily, but at the beginning, she's a young woman who is in love, and this relationship seems to have promise. At the end, she loses her beau, and she herself was on the brink of death. So in some ways, it is a story of World War I in the sense that, it's someone who almost dies. So it's like a story of that time, like a young person who almost dies in the peak of her life. And we have that kind of telling passage where she's telling her friend Townie to get things for her like makeup, etc. And Townie reads her list and says it's everything without something, so it'll be almost impossible to get. Like this idea that she is incomplete now, she's without something is the change, I think. Whereas before, she's kind of a young person going out dancing late at night. She's got a kind of interesting job. She has annoyances, but she's living a full life in a way. But afterwards, it seems that she's living a shadow life. That's how I read it. So in a way, there is a change, but it's an external change forced upon her. And it seems it's a change that she's not fully accepting yet, because she has that kind of imagined conversation with Adam, her boyfriend. And then when she moves, the ghost of him, it's not really a ghost, but it's like her imagination of him shifts away and he's gone. So it just seems to me like there's something lost at the end, and that's the change. There's the feeling of incompletion.
Porter herself, when she was talking about her bout with influenza, said that it divided her life in half, and all of her hair suddenly turned white, and she saw her life after the influenza as totally distinct from the life before. Do you think that Miranda will have a similar experience?
I think that comes through in the dream segment. I think I'll get into this a little later, but there's play with color that might indicate some change. Early on, there's a lot of blacks and whites, and then that gets traded for gray at the end. I think that's a symbol she hits fairly hard when she wakes up from her final dream.
All right, well, let's hit pause for a moment here then, Sam, before we get into that. Sure. When we come back, we'll discuss a couple different ways of understanding the novel. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. So, Sam, we were talking about duality and colors. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. As you said, this text plays a lot with duality. There's privately suffered pain versus communal joy. There's the dead being distinctly separate from and forgotten by those that continue living. Even colors are largely muted throughout. We're given a lot of blacks and whites, especially in the first half, except when confronted with death or the aftermath of it, which becomes a pale mix of grays and silvers. How do you view the shift at the end of the book when everything becomes gray to Miranda?
So the gray kind of is a melding of life and death, like you were talking about, Sam, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's interesting because I think she views this experience as her nearly dying. And now that she hasn't died, it's almost as if she has died and has come back to life, because she overtly references Lazarus in the passage. But, when she first comes out of her flu, she says, "Please open the window, please. I smell death in here." And then she says something, which is one of my favorite lines in the novel. She says something along the lines of, I've died and now I've been brought back to life only to die again, which is, pretty interesting. It's not that she has a second chance at life. It's that she's already died and she's going to die again. I think this kind of attitude is one factor, or it's an element of the novel that makes it interesting and literary to me, because I think it's very cliched for someone to have died and when they come back it's kind of a relief. This is a very kind of nuanced and complicated approach where she's brought back to life only to die again. It's kind of interesting that it's this approach toward not dying. And you have quite a bit of evidence here, like for example, when she comes back to life, she seems to look different. Like she seems to be a different person. And what I said earlier about her, being without something, as if something is missing, you might say it's like a part of her is gone now, right? Like she's a different, changed person now. This kind of blending of death and life, maybe. Or this is quite telling when she reads the letter from Adam. After she reads the letter from Adam, she says to Adam, I wish you had come back. What do you think I came back for, Adam, to be deceived like this? And then she says, Adam, now you need not die again, but still I wish you were here. This idea that he has died, and like her, if he had come back from the brink of death, he would only come back to die again. So it seems like this really had a traumatic effect on her, that it's not just, she survived and that's it. It's that she experienced death so intimately that now all she has to look forward to is her actual death. I mean, it's a really interesting kind of complicated way of dealing with this near-death experience and the aftermath. So if I were to say, like, what makes this good literature, I would point to that. Like, this kind of very complicated approach to a subject makes it interesting to me.
I think I agree with you here, but I would like to have the kind of aspect of, maybe we could call it survivor's guilt, amplified more. And she could have written maybe just a few more pages at the end, and I think it would have satisfied me more, because I understand that she has very difficult and complicated feelings about Adam dying, but I don't think that Porter explored those enough. I think that would have made it much more resonant.
Yeah, I guess I agree, although it does lead the reader to decide some of that, because you as the reader hopefully understand that Adam probably dies because of her, because he was attentive and was probably maybe overly close to her before bringing her to the hospital. That without that, he probably, ironically, probably would have died in the war, as both of them seem to assume he will. But yeah,
well, the armistice was signed pretty soon after, so maybe he would have survived.
That's true, which makes it that much more ironic, I guess.
I mentioned earlier that this ending reminds me of James Joyce's The Dead, and that's what really reminds me of The Dead is, in The Dead, the narrator, I think it's first person, the narrator dances with a young woman, dances with his wife, and she looks more beautiful than he imagined, and the relationship is on the outs, but this one night he seems to feel really close to her, she seems to be really close to him, and it turns out the whole night she's been thinking about her lover who died waiting outside her window because he loved her so much. It really seemed to echo The Dead, which I love as a short story. So I think that if you kind of read it in that context, the sort of intertextual reading, you might bring in some of that idea of guilt, because The Dead kind of hits on that. It's very much an idea also like this kind of modernist fiction set in World War I where people just die, right? Like with no reason. And the guilt is omnipresent too. So and there's some of that as well, I think.
Okay, so we had talked about the armistice very briefly just now, and that to me, I think, brings up one of the most interesting parts of the novel, where Porter, or not Porter, but rather Miranda, is in the hospital still suffering from the influenza, and the nurse tells her that they are celebrating because they had just signed the armistice. And that, to me, I think, hits a very poignant moment in the novel, because it shows how strongly personal suffering can overpower and occlude kind of this triumphant and happy moment, when it seems like something should be so wonderful that in fact it still is unpleasant to you just because of your own personal situation. So for me, one of the most central ideas and the most central conflict in this novel is the negotiation between the space for the personal in the face of large or shared public trauma. I find this in the novel, particularly with the salesmen who are pressuring her to buy the war bonds that she can't afford, or early in the novel when she confronts the wounded soldier when she's handing out candy and cigarettes, and the wounded soldier is unwilling to pretend to be cheerful. And also in her decision when they see the funerals on the road, she refuses to acknowledge the plague. She says something like, oh, well, let's not have any of that. So it seems like she's just refusing to engage with the public trauma as much as perhaps the public would like her to, especially when it comes to the war. Do you think that we can learn anything, or do you think that this novel can teach us anything about how we can deal with others and their own personal traumas as we are negotiating our own current shared trauma?
I think it can if we want to hear it, but it's tough. I think it's tough to take a very precise lesson as in terms of the trauma and how to deal with it. To me, the pain and the suffering was largely this intensely private thing. Like you mentioned, the wounded soldier doesn't want to have anything to do with her. And she takes offense at that and just flings her things down and leaves. So I guess if we take something from that interchange, it's that trauma needs to be dealt with on its own terms, not by the person not feeling that trauma. But I also don't know how you should approach trauma to embrace it. And it still seems like a very private thing.
I'm interested in this intersection of public and private, but I think one way of looking at this is there's kind of two conflicting forces here. There's the overt patriotism that's present during World War I and in this novel, but there's also this kind of undercurrent of annoyance or this feeling that the war is just killing everybody, and it's created this kind of farcical environment where people can kind of infringe on other people, and there seems to be no recrimination on that infringing. This kind of pressure to be a part of the war. I mean, she's not the only one feeling that, because her friend Townie also complains that she doesn't have the money to buy the bonds, and they both have that kind of shared anguish of like what to do in this situation. And she has that conversation with another woman who visit the hospital with her, and they both have a conversation where they have to be very cautious about what they say, because if they are too anti-war, they might be admonished. So I don't think she's alone in this kind of anti-war attitude. I think she's part of that undercurrent of an oppressed anti-war voice.
This was a time, this was under Woodrow Wilson, who I think 1917 was the Espionage Act, and then 1918 was the Sedition Act, which it really pushed people to not say anything bad about the war and not say anything bad about the government. So I think that it tiptoes that line fairly well of having these characters, dart their eyes around and whisper their anti-war sentiments.
Well, in our own times, I think that what the novel brings to mind is the people who complain that I would perhaps reject when I see people who kind of make fun of social distancing or make fun of the lockdown. My initial reaction is to ridicule them and say, oh, you're a fool. You don't realize that this is being done for your own benefit, and it's either do this or die. But I think that there is a humane reading of the novel that I think is something that a lot of people can learn from, is that these things are coping strategies, and it's a public situation that we're undergoing right now where we have to work together, but we have to give people space to vent, and people have their own personal and private responses to the situation that we have to validate. And we can't act like we understand the totality of the situation when we only understand the public face of it.
One of the frustrating things comparing the 1918 epidemic with COVID-19 today is that one of the reasons why influenza caught them by surprise is that people were already familiar with it. Flu by then had already become a nearly annual issue. And they even had some smaller epidemics prior in the earlier 1900s and late 1800s. So people didn't assume it would end up being a much worse strain. And both the spread and the symptoms ended up being way more severe. But COVID-19 is new, yet our country still isn't giving it the concern that it should. I'm embarrassed to say that I was guilty of that myself at first. But time has gone forward and the results are in, and yet we're still, as a country, not treating it with the severity that it needs to be treated.
So, Ed, do you think that Miranda is an analog for people nowadays who are not taking the illness as seriously because she's trying to avoid mention of it, or during the book she doesn't want to talk about these kinds of unpleasant things?
Yeah, I would say that she is related to that type of behavior, but my initial reaction to those people nowadays is to scorn them, because nowadays we have more advanced science and we more clearly understand how social distancing will affect the spread of a disease, and it's much clearer to us now. So I feel like at the time they couldn't afford to reject thinking, and they couldn't afford to reject being mindful of the virus, but they didn't know that. So in Miranda's time, if she said, well, I'm not going to think about it because it's very troubling to me, I understand nowadays that that was wrong and that it would have been better for her to have stayed at home. But, that's hindsight. It's not fair for me to criticize those people. But nowadays, even though people are responding to social distancing and we have science available to us to tell us how effective it is and how important it is, I still feel like even though I want to criticize those people, I shouldn't really, because it's their way of coping, and we're all going through this in our own kind of personal sphere, which just happens to be adjacent to the personal sphere of another person who's also undergoing a lot of uncertainty right now. So it's difficult for me to say that your approach to dealing with this is wrong when I only see it from the outside.
I think people are coping with different things, though, and I think that's part of the problem. The people that are coping with the illness and the threat of illness, that's one thing, but there is a large, or at least a vocal group of people who do not think that the illness is something worthy of this much worry or, protection, self-protection, self-isolation. And understandably, they're worried about money. They're worried about income. So I get that, but I don't understand it at the expense of health. There's a happy medium somewhere.
Yeah, see, that's the thing, is like we're of a certain kind of person who, we can take our pleasures at home and we can get access to the books and movies and the things that we like while still staying at home, and we can still work from home and do things like that. But a lot of the people who are upset now are losing income because, those are people who work with their hands. And if they're putting their hands on things, they're not earning money.
Right.
So it's difficult for me to criticize that source of concern. And people who are very connected with their family and friends and outdoor activities have had all of that ripped away from them. And while I understand that it's a sacrifice for everybody, it might not be exactly the same sacrifice for everybody.
Something that's interesting to me is looking at this book as someone who is willfully avoiding death. To me, if you view this book from that point of view, you have a kind of character who's kind of naive. She's presented with death from the very beginning, but she thinks it's not going to affect her, or she thinks, like she's just living her life, but in fact, she's surrounded by it. I mean, that to me is kind of an interesting reading of the novel. I don't think it's a particularly contentious reading. But it's interesting because this, if it is, a book about World War I, it very much falls into that tradition of a modernist World War I novel.
You said it's not a contentious reading, but actually here I would like to contend with that.
I would too.
Go ahead.
Well, you had said that basically she was reacting to kind of the specter of death on the horizon by saying, well, it's not going to happen to me. But I'm not entirely sure that's her attitude. My feeling is that her attitude is more like, well, it could happen to me, but it's so far outside of my control that the best thing that I can do is just ignore it. Because if I attend to it and I think about it, it's going to drive me crazy.
I see that a little bit too. And also, I think she recognizes that it's there all around her. I don't think she sees it happening to her so much, but she sees it happening to everyone else. She doesn't want Adam to leave. She doesn't say, run away with me, but she says it in her mind, I think. And she comes almost to the point of telling him not to go. And then as it happens that, he ends up dying in another way.
But they end up, joking about the fact that because he's going to be a sapper, and they joke, kind of, it's not really a joke, but they talk about how the average sapper dies, 8-9 minutes after completing his mission. It's this kind of approach to death. That's kind of what I'm talking about. Like it surrounds them. It's almost like they can't, or she can't process it, right? Because this idea that this person she's with is heading into a situation where he may immediately die. Like, it's a very difficult thing to process. And to me, that's kind of the heart of the book. It's how does a person deal with this kind of situation where people around them will die pretty soon. And, one way of dealing with it is avoiding it. But it turns out that death doesn't just come from war. It's also coming from pestilence in this case.
Adam knows he's going to die. They both know that he's going to die from war, or so they think. And he seems jovial for the most part. I mean, he talks early on in the book that he has not known pain. Pain is something that's foreign to him.
Again, I want to contend with that point. You're saying here that Sam knows that he's going to die. And,
Adam.
Yeah. Sam,
Sam,
you also should know that you're going to die.
Yeah.
But does Adam genuinely know? I think he is aware of the possibility, and the possibility might trouble him, but I don't think he knows it.
I think it's more than a possibility for him. There's one part, I don't remember exactly where it is, but he mentions I think either before they're going to go out at night, he says something about, this is my last leave, my last ever leave. There's a hesitance when he says it. I think that hesitance shows that either he's psyching himself up for the almost eventuality that he's going to die in the trenches, or he's come to terms with it.
I think it's very possible that you're right, but I don't think that Adam is a very well-developed character, so I don't think we can really know one way or the other exactly what he thinks.
Yeah, I guess so. He does feel flat, but I did get that sense from him. Does he mean anything to you, like as an idea?
I think he's a symbol for Miranda of happiness, some sort of pure goodness in her life, where everything else seems kind of tainted.
Yeah, I see that as well.
There's some symbolic gesturing where he's named Adam, obviously, and she describes him as healthy as an apple, right? So it's not this overt like Adam and Eve kind of symbology, but it's more like he's her other, right? He's the one that kind of is her other half, and then she causes his fall. In that reading or that way of understanding it, he is meaningful to her because he is, what defines her, or she's what defines him in a way.
That's interesting that you point that out, because they do use the word paradise at some point while they're together.
There's this passage in the book that I thought was interesting. She's talking to Adam on their date, and she says, Adam, the worst of war is the fear and suspicion and the awful expression in all the eyes you meet, as if they had pulled down the shutters over their minds and their hearts and were peering out at you, ready to leap if you make one gesture or say one word they do not understand instantly. It frightens me. I live in fear, too, and no one should have to live in fear. It's the skulking about and the lying. It's what war does to the mind and the heart, Adam, and you can't separate these two. What it does to them is worse than what it can do to the body.
Okay, well, let's take a break there, and when we come back, we can talk about the legacy of this novel and of Katherine Anne Porter's work.
Welcome back. Let's talk a little bit about the legacy of Pale Horse, Pale Rider. This short novel was published over 80 years ago and has been getting some recognition recently, like we talked about, because of the subject matter. It's always been on my radar, of course, as I mentioned before, because she's one of those writers that always gets referenced by other writers and writing teachers. So what is it that you think makes her a, quote, writer's writer?
So I think for me, she has a strong authorial voice. When I read her, I do have a sense of the power of her personality. She seems like a very powerful person, which I think is captivating in the sense that you are kind of reading her and you get to the feeling that you're in the presence of a powerful mind, which is very difficult, I think, for a lot of novelists to pull off, to kind of be not just persuasive, but to gather the reader's trust that way, to let the reader kind of follow you so easily. So that to me is something that I think that other writers probably recognize in Porter, that perhaps readers don't really search out as much as they should.
For me, I think part of it is she does a lot of things well and kind of to a baseline level, which sounds bad, but it's not, because there are some writers who really struggle with certain aspects of writing. For example, they might be great at plot, but their prose is awful. I think she just kind of does everything really well. And she does something that I really like, which is that she she's very thematic. She kind of approaches a story almost like a composition, not like a linear story, but rather like she pieces together things that work well, kind of like in a puzzle. And they don't really form a coherent story the way that we might want from a realist story, but they kind of all work together and reinforce each other, and they kind of layer on each other. And that's what I really like about her writing. In this story, it's very atmospheric. It's all about death and about people who live in this atmosphere of almost like paranoia, where death is around the corner. And then she actually has this kind of near-death encounter, and then she ends up becoming this kind of blended, half-dead, half-alive person. Like, all of that is very interesting to me because of how she achieves it. It's very understated, so if you read it without being mindful of that, you might not be fully aware that this is what's going on. But if you kind of look at it, it's all there from the very beginning. To me, that's what makes her a strong writer and makes this a strong story. She's someone who just kind of does everything well, but this one aspect of kind of elusive writing is done, for me, in a very strong manner here.
That goes along with something that I read about her writing method, I guess. She would write a lot of things and not be satisfied with them and set them aside for months or years at a time before coming back and, cannibalizing pieces from those things she'd written earlier in order to make the full piece later on. So it's very possible that this was, years in the making.
I had said earlier that I thought that, in a sense, she was ahead of her time, but I think one of the difficulties that I had with reading this novel is that it felt very much of its time. I don't think it's fair for me to be critical of the work or of Porter in general, but I do think that my own tastes, here I say I'm exposing more the limitations that I have as a reader rather than limitations that Porter has as a writer. But my own tastes, I prefer something that is more experimental and more playful. And to me, I agree with what James is saying, that she has a very solid grasp of the fundamentals. She's not deficient in any particular aspect of storytelling. There isn't that spark that I get when I read something more experimental or something more unusual. It just seems like somebody who has really, really honed her craft, and she knows how to tell a story, but not how to captivate me as a reader.
For me, it really is a distinction between more modernist work and a more postmodern work. Like, her work is definitely not playful, and it can be a slog if what you want is a more postmodern work.
You'd been comparing her to James Joyce, though, and I think that Joyce is much more playful and experimental than her. I think that she's very solid, but solid is sometimes not what you want. Sometimes you want to be kind of skating on thin ice, and you want to be involved in an experiment that just barely works.
Well, or one of her contemporaries would have been Flannery O'Connor, right?
Yeah, I think Flannery O'Connor is also much more intriguing.
Right. Southern Gothic style, so it's a lot more visceral. But that attention to detail there, we see overtures here rather than minute details as much. I think that played a part for me.
For me, I think she's most similar to Faulkner. She reads a lot like Faulkner, and I think Faulkner is kind of like a maximalist in a way, which is not usually the style I go for, but it's that kind of method of writing where it seems very tight. There are a lot of allusions, sometimes biblical allusions. I think it's hard to enjoy Faulkner. Like, everyone who likes Faulkner, I think, have a certain kind of sour attitude toward life, maybe. So she kind of reminds me of that. It's definitely not playful. And I don't think people who read Faulkner would say he's a playful writer, but he is experimental. Like, what he does with story structure is experimental, but it's not playful.
There is a difference in my mind between art enjoyment and art appreciation. And I can appreciate Porter and I can understand in a technical level with her craft what she's doing, and I can understand in a technical way how what she's writing can be beautiful or can be moving, but it's never visceral. I'm never enjoying it. I never have that skating on thin ice feeling that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So, how much of this do you think is your changing tastes? Because you did mention that you liked James Joyce. Do you think that modern readers today will have a hard time appreciating Porter, even on that level of appreciating her craft?
I don't think so. I think she actually has a lot to offer a lot of people. Came across a lot of people who regularly commended this story or this short novel and put it at the tops of their lists. This definitely has a space for it in today's world.
Yeah, I'm not really equipped to answer your question, James, because my exposure to Porter is very, very limited. But I do think that there is some evidence that Porter has been a little bit neglected. I encountered an article, it's actually on NPR. So I guess Alice McDermott was actually on the radio talking about this, and she said that she was teaching Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and one of her students came into class with a library discard copy, and Alice McDermott was so upset that this was being discarded by the library, and the library had stamped inside that there was little interest in this book. So I think that there is some anecdotal evidence, at least, that this particular work, and maybe Porter in general, is maybe due for a comeback or maybe due for a rediscovery?
I'm not sure. I think, if I were teaching this book, I would only really teach it in the context of modernist literature or pandemic literature like we're reading now, or in a creative writing class. And I suspect that this is the book that students will just skip over, even though it's so short. It's just hard to get into, I think.
If our circumstances globally were different, I don't think I would have picked this book up. Now, saying that, I am moderately happy that I picked it up, but if I hadn't read it, I don't think that there would be a Pale Horse, Pale Rider sized hole in my heart that needed to be filled. I would have gladly have moved on to the next thing.
Well, I'm glad you picked it up. It's been on my short list or long list, honestly. And I haven't read it before. So now that you've recommended it, and now that we've had this discussion, I feel like I got a lot out of it. Like I read this 2.5 times, the ending 3 times. So I like it. I don't think it's just not enjoyable in the way that some media or some stories are. It's enjoyable in a way where if you're a writer and you want to learn how a writer achieves a certain aim, it's interesting to look at. That's how it's enjoyable. And I think it's only enjoyable for a particular subset of readers. So that's why I don't think it'll actually have much traction going forward. I'm afraid it'll continue to be neglected, to be honest.
Well, Sam, what about you? Do you think you're going to seek out more Katherine Ann Porter?
No, I wouldn't be opposed to reading something down the line. I don't see myself going out of my way.
I've got one short question for you guys before we conclude, and that is, would you guys go out of your way to read her other 2 long short stories or short novels in the collection?
I skimmed Old Mortality after you told me that it featured Miranda, and it was interesting in a different way. It lacked the kind of current relevance to our own current situation, but again, it's like if I would live forever, I would read it, but since I won't live forever, there are other things that are much more interesting on my bookshelf.
What about you, Sam?
Yeah, I don't feel a strong desire or need to read it. I agree. If I were to live forever, I would certainly be happy to pick it up, but I wasn't in love with this one. I enjoyed it, but I don't feel like I needed to read more of her work.
If a person were actually immortal, the context for enjoying art would completely be ruined anyways.
True.
If I knew I was going to live forever, I wouldn't be reading anything at all.
Well, especially this book, which is so much about death that person would find it utterly inconceivable.
Yeah.
Why talk about this guy riding a horse? What's going on here? None of it makes any sense.
What about you, James?
Probably no, but mostly because we've got a long list of books to read and discuss ahead of us, and we've got to move on. So let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. If you have feedback for us, you can find us at Canonical Pod on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a discussion on the book Blindness by Jose Saramago. If you're interested in following our discussion, please go ahead and find a copy of that book. If you want to support us, you can use our affiliate link below. Until next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.